All right, so you're watching the continued overview of Section 3 of the NAWAPA 21 Special Report, how NAWAPA 21 will restore the system of public credit. This pamphlet, the special report, and especially Section 3 here, how the nation's financial system and the government's control over that financial system is linked in with the building of this future project. If it is actually the fundamental question right now in the United States, if we're going to have a government that is committed to the national interest. And this means the national interest on all measures right now, that all the problems that are facing the country, given the current administration and lack of understanding of this central principle over the preceding administrations. Now, what I'm going to continue on here today is the question of the foundation of this system of public credit by Alexander Hamilton working with Robert Morris and the other patriots that were all of whose actions went into this foundation. Where we were sitting in the middle of a war, 1779, beginning to have a very bad depreciation of the U.S. continental emitted bills of credit. The Congress had the power to emit bills of credit according to the Articles of Confederation. The problem was the necessary powers to actually bring credits behind that emission wasn't there. And what you can see in looking at what Hamilton wrote to Morris and other people in those years sitting as aide-de-camp to General Washington, staying up all night reading books on finance and history of other unions that collapsed, the Swiss cantons, the German Diet, the Greek states. The failure to unify the resources as for one national intent has always subjected these groupings to be overcome by a foreign power. And Alexander Hamilton was committed to make sure that we did not reenact such a failed union, essentially a disunion of separate states. So it was very clear in the middle of the war that unless we gave the necessary powers to the Congress, we would not have a nation after the war. And if you read the writings of Robert Morris, you find that the war is not over with Yorktown. In October of 1781, we may have won the decisive battle in the field, but the real decisive battle had to be won in were we going to gain a constitution that would be able to channel the resources of the country such that we would have a financial system that would be based on credit, where the circulating currency is not based on what the actual physical market commerce is at that one moment, but where the future intent is to go. And the creation of what was the monetary debts of the states and the domestic debts into now a source for investment was the intent of Robert Morris and Hamilton at that earlier phase. And in 1781 was the decisive year where we're coming into a question of whether we're going to actually win the battles. And there was a meeting with Robert Morris and George Washington. And the credit of Robert Morris as an individual himself, but his intent with Hamilton to bring a loan that would be used as a fund for the economy as a whole may have been actually crucial in Washington's decision to go to Yorktown itself. That's not yet clear, but what is completely clear is that from the beginning of Robert Morris's assumption as continental financier in 1781 in July, May, his entire plan was based around a restoration, or essentially establishing our credit, or restoring our credit. And Hamilton writes to Morris the problem with the currency, which was not that we were emitting currency. Paper currency, there's no problem. The problem is are the resources of the country as a whole channeled behind that currency that's emitted? And so what Hamilton wrote to Morris was, we need a foreign loan. Essentially, we're going to have to take something alone. We can't, the taxes weren't coming in. The states were all essentially bankrupt. What they were willing to contribute and versus what the resources were widely varied. There was nothing to hold them accountable. And so we needed some kind of loan, but simply throwing that loan into buying supplies for the Army and food would only put off an inevitable, you're pulling something into a leaky ship. The issue, what he looked at, was unifying the interests of those who are loaning with the interests of the country. And if you do that, what he did is he said, we will take a loan, we will direct this fund, of which the loan will be the capital, such that those who are investing will profit. And essentially they will end up getting greater advantages by loaning the money than they would in just having their money invested in trade. And Hamilton said, we're going to erect a massive credit on which will be lent. And I mean an institution of a national bank. And that letter in 1780, I think it was, to Robert Morris, he first provides this idea. And there's a back and forth with Robert Morris on this. Hamilton outlined a charter for the bank in 1781 with Robert Morris and worked this out with James Wilson and Robert Morris. James Wilson ended up being the spokesman of what was finally chartered in December of 1781 as the first national bank. This was the Bank of North America. So the intention of this bank was that we would have a national debt to now look over with a Congress, but the national bank would be able to fund that national debt. And in that sense, Hamilton said a national debt will therefore be a national blessing because it will be a cement of the Union. But he did not mean it in the way that people have been interpreting this, and we'll see how this works out. The bank was intended, therefore, to replace the circulating paper currency, which became worthless. It was necessary to continue to admit it. Again, that wasn't the problem. The problem was what we're going through here, the lack of powers of the Congress to unify the resources. So the intention was to replace those with banknotes of this bank, and there would now be a unified means of taxation through the banknotes was the intent. It would help trade and commerce. People would pay their taxes more regularly, being aided by the bank. There would be increased capability of lending, and so forth. The problem was that this bank could not achieve a full, essentially, could not achieve the full status of what it was intended to be because of the lack of the powers of the government. There was no authority in the Congress to rein in and a general taxation over the states. They couldn't even get them to do a 5% tariff on imported goods and pay that to a 5% duty on goods and get that toward Congress. Robert Morris tried to do that in 1782 and failed. Nobody would initiate it. They wanted to be popular out in the states. They didn't want to, essentially bend toward the Continental Congress. And Robert Morris described the situation, actually intended to resign, and people wanted to keep him in there. There's also a whole period of financial warfare, 1782, people working directly with the British Crown at that time, the Prime Minister, in now how we defeat the United States, even though they've won this battle. And what Robert Morris writes is, without the ability to force the hand of the British by showing that our credit was sound and that we were going to be able to exist financially, they would never have settled the peace treaty. So in that sense, again, the war continued as a basis of how do we essentially set up this system. And the early National Bank was key in this, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for everything, and we'll see why. We'll see what made it become sufficient. So, but in this early period, Hamilton defined what was really the key principle of a paper currency, the principle of a paper currency. And people don't have an understanding of this today, is that what gave credit for this period of time behind the United States in early 1782, and Robert Morris writes that the Department of Finances, of which he was appointed, could not have fulfilled its task without this bank, was not that there was gold in the bank. And so there's not that they got a loan of gold to put credit behind the currency. It was because it united the resources of the public and private, of the people who were investing in the bank, and therefore uniting then the resources of the country through trade. Now, did it actualize itself completely? No, but Hamilton showed in that right then that he was essentially understanding that principle and defined it as a successful, what successful currency means. So there was supposed to be a lot of things that bank would end up doing, but the key principle of it was that the national bank becomes the necessary means of the power of government to increase industry, agriculture, and the confidence in a currency. And essentially, that lived out its intent. There was a whole crisis with that bank. James Wilson, one of the most active people at the Constitutional Convention, ended up writing a defense of that bank and the constitutionality of the bank in 1785. But where we're going now is into then the next steps. Essentially, we recognize the failure of the Union, 1782-83. Robert Morris, writing on what we need to do, he wrote a long book to the country in 1784 on where we would end up back in shackles of Britain were we not to make this breakthrough. And Hamilton was working with him the entire time. Other people were working at this time. And we ended up having essentially a grouping set up that began to study the needed transformation, and Hamilton led this. We go through this in Section 3. I'll just say now that it led to the Constitutional Convention. The key players at the convention were the key people working with Robert Morris and Franklin in that bank. James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, Ben Franklin. Robert Morris was the right-hand man of Ben Franklin. So this is the true story of how the nation was won, and the intention was set up by these individuals to then use those powers of Congress that were won to fund and support the operations of the means of government, which is the national bank, in order to set and found our public credit as the source of value. And here's how it worked. What we did is, rather than say, here's these monetary debts, and some people wanted to just say, these are monetary debts that we shouldn't have. Okay, yes, we borrowed money from people during the war, but for the benefit of all, let's just cancel most of this stuff because a lot of soldiers got ripped off by speculators who wanted to buy their certificates through debt payment. And this is not fair to the soldiers and other people to then just to actually make good upon these debts because we'll be paying these speculators and so on. Morris and Hamilton realized that was a huge mistake, and had we actually followed through with the recommendations of Madison and Jefferson and other people at the time that were opposing what the group, Ben Franklin, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, Hamilton, James Wilson, and others, wanted to do at that time, we would probably have failed as a union, but in any case, practically speaking here, we would have been working with an economy of an order of magnitude less power, because what ended up being put in circulation was this full national debt. What he did is Hamilton said, we're going to take out another loan. We're going to take out a loan for the full amount of the domestic and state debts. Not a monetary loan, which is obviously just be another debt upon another debt. What he said is, all of you who received certificates during the war for debt, whether directly from the Treasury or from one of the commissioners in the state for materials that your payment as a soldier, for loans that you gave to the Continental Congress to fund the war, and so on, and including the foreign debt. We want to borrow back that claim of debt, the certificate that had been handed out in various forms. There was various rainbow of different kinds of certificates with all kinds of different interest. Hamilton said, we're going to borrow from you all of these certificates. So we take out a loan for the full amount of the domestic and state debts, which the domestic debts were $42.4 million and the state debts were $21.5. So we took out a full loan. People who wanted to partake in this subscription of the loan handed in their certificates of claims of debt. And in in place of that, received a new U.S. from the U.S. Congress, had now become a new nation. So now it's a new government, United States government, 1790, with a new intent and powers of government to call forth the resources of the nation to make good on this newly issued debt. So the newly issued certificates were given out with various degrees of interest for the amount that they subscribed. 1/3 was the 6% interest payment, 1/3 was the 6% that wouldn't start till 1800, and 1/3 of it was a 3% interest. And all of this ended up being a lower interest than what was the going interest, and became therefore revenue for Hamilton and the administration and the Treasury to actually fund the debt, which is, again, according to the principle that a sovereign nation, if it wants to use its power, can essentially work out the terms on which it makes good on its debt according to its own interests, not the interests of speculators, the interests of people who are actually working people, manufacturers, businessmen, these kinds of people. It's to their interest to work with the sovereign government to work out that. So Hamilton said, with Morris and others, that this is the price of liberty. The debt that we accrued during the war was accrued in the intention to found a sovereign nation. Are you going to say now that that debt is a burden to be cast off? No. This is a price of liberty, which, if we continue that intention, we will show that that is value itself. And you got to get a sense of what this really meant. We were saying that these full debts that we accrued, we're going to turn this into value, something which hasn't been paid off. We're turning this debt, what we accrued during the war, and state and domestic debts were now issued back out, circulating around the country as currency, as state banks would accept as value, because the new government had intended to make good upon this over time. So that instantly made the public debt circulate as potential over 60 million as now circulatable currency. So it was that act by Hamilton. And in fact, within the period of his assuming the administration, the value of that debt increased 300%, because of his intention is simply, as a new Treasury Secretary, to act with these powers of Congress. Now, according to what Hamilton writes at the end of his report on public credit, where he says that in order to make the public credit immortal, it's his maxim that every created debt has to be tied with a means of extinguishment. And that is essentially saying that a debt is not a self-evident object here. It's an intention by the government to take certain actions by which a debt will be fulfilled, meaning something assumed as a priority will be linked to the actions that are associated with making good on that priority. In this case, tariffs. What we did is we took a new array of measures by the Congress to enact a series of tariffs that were linked to now the payment of the interest on these newly issued certificates. So we linked them both together. Congress's first major act of Congress, in fact, the second act, the first one was just something to get the room going, so to speak. The second act of Congress, 1789, July 4th, was to apply a duty on imported goods. What we did now, after the August 4th Act, in August 10th, we increased those duties. There's an array of duties. If you read through the Act of Congress, you can find this online. August 10th, 1790. All kinds of things, internal and imported, and tax on liquor and all these kinds of things, chocolates, coffee, all these things, spirits, as a array of kinds, all these kinds of liquors, were put. August 4th, let me just backtrack here, is that first act was the act to provide for the public debts, for the payment of them. What we did is we said of these duties on August 10th, 600,000 of those revenues will go toward the common defense and general welfare, the needs of government. Everything left over will go toward the payment on the interest of the foreign debt. So we applied all of these duties. And what they did is, according to the August 4th Act a few days before, what we had is $600,000 would be allocated from the revenues of the government, largely all these import duties, toward the common defense and general welfare. The second would be going toward the payment of interest. Anything left over would go toward now the payment of the domestic interest. First, the foreign interest payments, and now the interest on the public debt certificates that had been issued for this subscribed loan. So after that, August 12th, a few days later, there was an act to provide for further provision to provide for the public debt. And in this one, it authorized certain loans that could be taken out by the President of the United States toward making good upon the public debt, and including using these other loans to purchase the public debt and increase the value, essentially sinking the principal of these certificates to make sure that if there was less of them in circulation, we would increase the value and the intent of the government to make good upon it, which is the essential principle. So whatever was required, and Hamilton outlined that this would be done such that any kind of excess revenue would go toward making good on that debt, sinking the principal, paying the interest. And what he had outlined in his 1790 public credit report is kind of a complicated paper, but what's in there is he talks about a first loan and a second loan. The first is for the state debts and the domestic debts. The second loan was to be another loan to the government for $10 million. This loan would be lent out, it would be what he talks about being as a source to then lend at a higher interest than these other certificates. So this actual loan became, once the Congress enacted these acts to start funding the public debt and immediately turning them into a valid circulatable currency for value, the second loan now became the National Bank paper, a report to Congress. And so in his definition of the National Bank, what he said is those people who subscribed to the first loan and who received a new certificate of government by loaning their original debt to the government, and so now they have this new certificate at different interest, could take those certificates and become subscribers to the capital stock of a fund to be lent, and the National Bank, which then received various other qualities in the course of this paper. Originally, in the public credit paper, he posed it as simply just a credit fund for lending. But what we did is we took each purchased stock. If you wanted to get a stock of this National Bank, 3/4 of it was to be purchased with your certificates, and then if you had some gold, silver, 1/4 of it you'd be able to buy a stock in the bank. $10 million was the total capital. $8 million was were these shares that would be bought according to 3/4 part public debt and 1/4 part specie. So what we had is we had the use of these certificates. The government itself subscribed for $2 million according to these acts to borrow money in order to itself be invested in the bank. The full weight of the government behind as actually being a joint subscriber united the public and the private interest in this bank. The bank would now be funded with the powers now capable of calling forth the resources of the country, and the benefits of banking essentially as something that had existed in the world before. People misinterpret what Hamilton did by saying he was simply reenacting the Bank of England or something. We'll go through. This bank was a terrible feature of imported from Amsterdam, the Bank of Amsterdam, nothing but a speculative instrument imported from the Venetian-controlled Amsterdam, now Venetian-controlled England. The Bank of England was set up by the people who took over England to destroy the country. What Hamilton did was entirely different, a species differentiation of quality. What he did is he used the benefits of banking, now fused with this massive fund of public debt, the intention to make good, the intention that carried over to make us a sovereign nation with the war, fused with the power of the whole economy and funded with the powers of the sovereign government. His idea was that the means of exchange, money as something which is only the means of exchange, that the means of exchange that is in circulation doesn't have a self-evident value. It doesn't have a value that's outside the process of the whole government's unification of the resources of the country and the intention where it's going. So it's something that's in that environment, and the determination of value is done by the government and in relation to the reflection of the rest of the power of the physical economy. Now, the chief functions of the bank were, one, to create this medium of exchange, which was a reflection of this whole process, but to create a unified medium of exchange so that that process in the economy and the government operations, making sure we established ourselves and could function and defend ourselves against foreign powers, could be carried out. Also, as this credit fund for lending. So these were the two chief qualities of the National Bank. We'll go through now a bit of the detail of how the whole process worked in reorganizing the economy. First was, as I say, a medium of exchange, a national uniform medium of exchange through banknotes. So now people were accepting as payment were banknotes. Now you don't have idle gold and silver sitting around. You have this money can be in the bank and being lent in the form of banknotes. The public debt that's sitting in the bank is now being lent out as banknotes that people are now using for payment. We had a unified medium now for people to pay taxes. This aided the government in many ways, and also aided in the fact that the bank was something that would lend, and also the associated state banks, on the credit of an individual. If the individual didn't have money, that's fine. They're lending on this individual to build something and so on, and also help them pay their taxes. So the timing and everything becomes much more basically expectable. You can count on it, and now you can order the operations of the government according to that. It aided also in the regulation of commerce. The state-by-state exchanges with separate forms of money is actually an added expense to industry, a big one. That's no longer burdened. Now you have a uniform currency. Also regulating commerce, there were many loans that Hamilton worked out with the bank to go toward people who were bringing in, as merchants, goods into the country, didn't have the money at that time to pay the import duty. The bank would loan the individual, be it the Baltimore branch or wherever it was, to the individual. Now the import duties can come in at a regular time and commerce can flow. So this is something that now we take for granted, some of these features, but it's important to understand how this thing was functioned and set up at that time and transformed the whole economy. It also helped fund the debt, and chiefly this was a key aspect, that the interest that was paid out on these certificates could now be paid out through the banknotes, and the specie of the United States government was not then sitting idle, essentially just waiting to go out as payment on the interest. And that also increased the circulation of the country as a whole. And this was the intent, to get a unified national currency. And if you don't think that's a problem, we can look at the periods later of what happened between the ending of the charter, the First National Bank, and during the period of the War of 1812, 1811, 1816, the chaos that ensued, and the lack of circulating medium again, and the same thing before Lincoln did what he did. So the borrowing from the National Bank and aiding the funding of the public debt was also done to directly purchase the public debt. We had a certain speculative attack in the early time of the bank, and purchase the debt according to the Act, August 12th of Congress. We also borrowed from the bank for other internal government operations at the time. Essentially, also, what we did is we were borrowing from a bank that's not we're chains ourselves as this foreign private entity or something. And people misunderstand that the fact what we were borrowing from is a bank that we chartered that we could end at any time as Congress if we wanted to, and a bank whose capital was fused with the government finances. It was not something separate. It was fused with our own interest. And as the economy itself was developing, so the value of the public debt was going up. So the capital stock was going up. The national bank's capital was a reflection of the power of the economy as a whole. These were not money debts. This is a whole process of unifying the resources of the country. And essentially, in that way, debt was redefined in this way. It was the first time ever we have a sovereign nation. The meaning of debt is tied in with this whole process, unifying the resources of the country and building this economy, and essentially how this currency was then actually used. As industry went up, the bank capital went up. So there are other qualities of the bank were important. The bank was not allowed to purchase public debt, as the current operation with the Federal Reserve is being carried out. It was explicitly prohibited. Therefore, the value of the public debt was regulated by the Treasury and the Congress, and it could therefore be determined as a certain regulation of the value of the currency in circulation by controlling the value of the public debt. The bank could not essentially just, as we've seen now, infinitely buy up the debt and have this, which is intrinsically hyperinflationary, to just continually increase the money supply and buy more debt and indebtedness and so forth. That was one feature. The other feature was that the capital stock was limited to the actual public debt and other specie, and the initial amount, what was in the capital of the bank. The bank could not leverage a million times to loan for something speculative. So in a sense, the intention, the time span of the bank, the operation, was tied to making good on this public debt. Also, no loans could go out without authorization of Congress to the states and foreign governments. So again, there's this regulation feature of what this thing is doing, entirely different than what we're seeing right now with the Federal Reserve. Also a depository for government revenues. This again, this huge feature of this fund, which we don't see with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation back in Roosevelt's time. This bank, the National Bank, and also the Second National Bank, were depositories for all of the revenues, such that before they were allocated, before they were appropriated, they could be committed to all these kinds of actions in the meantime, so that the full resources of the country are always in operation, not sitting in iron boxes waiting to be paid, which is the difference of money and credit. The National Bank allows the entire resources of the country to be fused, intersecting within and without this means of government to build a country. And that's the true meaning of the bank. Obviously, if the government doesn't intend to build the country, then you have a bank which becomes merely some financial instrument that can be used for all kinds of other purposes. Or it can be limited by speculators who really don't want to build anything, and you run into the kinds of things that Felix Rohatyn's proposing, these infrastructure banks, little droplets of capital for some teeny little project, completely different what we're talking about here. This is something that's infused with the entire resources of the country, and a future-oriented lending, a credit lending institution, which is really the key point of the entire bank. So what we had was that the public debt became equal to money, and it actualized itself as we developed and began building the country. And this process is not completely actualized under the Washington administration. We had essentially a Congress that was opposed to some of the policies of Hamilton to build up the industries and internal improvements, which finally didn't become resolved until later, when James Monroe made a personal transformation to realize what Hamilton wrote in the Subject of Manufacturers Report, which is that in Article 1, Section 8, we say that we have this, he included the same clause that's in the general welfare to provide for the common defense and general welfare. And essentially, the power over money is only limited by that phrase, general welfare, because it had to encompass all of the possible operations of government. And part of that is appropriating revenues to build canals, rails, and associated this long-term loaning for these purposes. This was finally done in wide scale during the John Quincy Adams administration. So this is the essential foundation of how the United States system of public credit worked. The powers of Congress to fund the debts over a long period of time relative to that sovereign nation, and working with a credit institution, and on the credit of the United States, working out the kinds of loaning and using the public debt as the source of investment. The intention, therefore, to build something in the future is what is actually the value in the present. And the National Bank as the institution in which this circulatable currency increases by an order of magnitude than it would if we were just looking at a treasury issuing debt or something. So this is the key. This is the central map, and we'll develop this more in the next installment.